Welcome back. So I just showed you how to make marshmallow fondant, and now I'm going to show you how to cover a cake with that fondant or some different fondant that I have. Really quick, to know how much fondant to have to cover a cake, you pretty much want to look at the recipe, how much the recipe will yield, and then either double or triple it, or look at the weight, anything like that. Basically, for an 8-inch cake, there we go, you want to have double the amount of ounces to cover that cake. So if you have an 8-inch cake, you want to double the 8 ounces, so 16 ounces, about a pound of marshmallow fondant or store-bought fondant will cover that cake. I normally like to have a little bit more than that, just so you have some left over for decorations, or especially for rolling it out and covering the cake. It's nice to have a much bigger piece to work with. So if you want to triple the recipe or triple the amount that you have, then that will obviously definitely cover that cake and leave some left over for decorations and just make it easier to roll it out and cover it and everything. Okay, so you're going to have your work surface laid out here. I have one of these really nice silicone mats. They work really, really well, especially when you have a bigger piece of fondant to roll out. It's a really large area that you can work with. You can get a smaller mat that looks like these. This is a Wilton roll and cut mat. These are really nice to use because they do have markings and measurements on them, and so you can see, you know, how big you need to get to cover your cake, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But if you have just one of the regular silicone mats, I just use a ruler to measure it. So let's get to covering this cake. Okay, so again, my fondant feels just a little bit soft, so I'm going to be using powdered sugar to cover my work surface. You can use shortening, that works just fine, but I'm going to be using powdered sugar today. And one really great little helper for spreading out your powdered sugar is making a little dusting puff. This is just one of those reusable cloths. I laid it out flat, put some powdered sugar in the middle of it, and then tied it up with a little rubber band. And that way I can just dust my work surface and my fondant really easily. I don't have powdered sugar flying everywhere from pouring it out from the bag, and it's just a handy little tool to have. Okay, so we're going to dust that, and then I'm going to get my rolling pin, and this again is one of the huge fondant rolling pins. You don't have to have one of these. You can use one of the regular kitchen rolling pins. That works just fine. I tend to like to use these just because they are weighted, and so you don't have to push so hard to roll out your fondant. It kind of helps you. It's also got these really nice curved edges. If you use a regular edged rolling pin, then it sometimes leaves marks and grooves in your fondant depending on the big piece that you're rolling out. So whichever one you want to use will work just fine. Okay, so we're going to start rolling this out. And a lot of times when I'm teaching a class about fondant, I notice that a lot of students usually push down and kind of scoot the rolling pin over their fondant. And I want to emphasize not to do that. It will rip and tear your fondant. So you just want to make sure it rolls freely in your hands and that you're not pushing against the fondant, but you're rolling it out. You always want to start in the middle and push out towards the center, or push out towards the edges. That way you can guarantee a nice even thickness of fondant throughout. It really doesn't matter what kind of a shape you use, but you know, if you're going to do a square cake, you can still use a circular piece of fondant. That works out just fine. But I generally like to just roll it kind of in a circular shape to make sure it's going to cover everything. Okay, so we rolled it out a little bit here. I'm going to stop and check my fondant. I want to make sure, yep, see it's sticking just a little bit here on the center of my mat. So I'm going to get some more powdered sugar in there to make sure that it doesn't stick because it's really awful to spend so much time rolling it out and then have it stick on you and you have to crumble it back up and restart. It's just devastating. So, okay, so we're going to roll this out some more. You want the thickness of this to be about 1/8 of an inch, and I'm sure all of you know what 1/8 of an inch is. Oh, of course. It's about the thickness of a nickel. So if you need to get a nickel and put it next to your fondant here, you can do that just to keep checking with yourself. How thick is this supposed to be? With those mats that have the markings on them, the Wilton roll and cut mats, those work really well for this purpose. If you can start to see the lines of that mat, the markings and stuff through the fondant, then you know you've got it thin enough. A lot of times if your fondant is colored, you won't be able to see it, but generally you can. So, okay, so we've got a nice rolled out piece of fondant here. Another thing to be able to tell if your fondant is sticking to the mat, if it doesn't roll out very easily and smoothly for you, if you're really having to push on it to make the edges roll out, then it's probably sticking to your mat. So you'll want to make sure that you go back and check it and see, nope, I've got it easily comes off there. Yep, everything's nice and good. Okay, so we've got our fondant. Now, if my cake was not ready, then what I would want to do is take some plastic wrap and cover this fondant so it doesn't get all stiff and dry. A lot of times when your fondant gets too dry, it gets these little wrinkles in it. They call it elephant skin. It looks really wrinkly and bad. So you want to make sure that you cover it up so that it doesn't get that. It doesn't get all dried out. Another thing that you can do is just take some shortening like I'm doing and just rubbing it onto the surface of your fondant here. Just a little bit, doesn't need very much. I know some people have an aversion to shortening, so it doesn't take too much. Okay, so we're going to lay that out just like that, and we're going to get our cake. Really quick, some information about preparing your cake. You want to make sure, this is just a styrofoam dummy of course, but you want to make sure that your cake has a thin layer of icing on it. It doesn't have to have that official thick layer of icing on it. If it's too thick, then it's going to squish out the bottom as you're smoothing out your cake. So you want to make sure it's a nice thin layer. You could probably still see the cake through it, and that's completely fine. You want to put it on a cake board, so it's on a little board all by itself. Either that or put it on the final platter or whatever you're going to serve it on, display it on. There we go. But a lot of times I like to have it on its own cake board, sitting by itself, so I can work on it, do everything, without messing up that display piece where I'm going to put it. It'll take a lot of cleanup and everything to get it nice and clean after you've done all this fondant and everything on top of it. Okay, so we've got our little cake, and I like to use my turntable. You'll see here in a second why. But we're going to transfer this piece of fondant on top of here. Because it's a small piece and it's a small area, I'm just going to pick this up and put it on top, kind of like a big pizza dough. Another way that you could do this, let me move everything here, and because this is a nice flexible silicone mat, you can just take your arm underneath it like this and lift it up and flip it over on top of your cake. And that works out really well, especially if it's a large cake that you're going to cover. Other ways to do it, you've probably seen on TV how they just take their rolling pin and they roll the fondant onto the rolling pin and then put it on top of their cake. With the marshmallow fondant, that doesn't really work. It's such a soft consistency that it often sticks to itself. You'll need to put tons of powdered sugar on it and then put it on top of there really fast to make sure that it's not very tightly rolled onto your rolling pin. It just, yeah, I don't know. It's too much to mess with, so I usually don't do it. Some store-bought fondants work really well for that. So, okay, so we're going to take this, and I'm going to gently pick it up with my hands, and then lay it down on top of my cake. Now, immediately, it's obvious that this is a large piece, definitely covers my cake and everything. So the first thing that I want to do is take my pizza cutter here, and you can use a knife, you can use a pizza cutter, whatever you want, and I'm just going to cut off a lot of this excess fondant here. The reason why you want to do that is because the excess weight of this fondant is going to pull down on the fondant that's covering the cake, and it's going to rip and tear the edges here. So you want to make sure that it's not too heavy and pulling on your edges, especially if you're doing like a square cake that has sharper corners. I love these styrofoam dummies that have the contoured edges. This is more realistic to a cake when it has icing on the cake and everything, and then the weight of the fondant gets on top of it. It normally does this little curving action here on the edges of your cake. So yeah, I really like the contoured cake dummies. Okay, so this extra piece of fondant here that's left over, really quick, I'm going to talk to you about how to store your fondant. So when you've got your extra fondant that you're all done with, you want to kind of roll this into a little log shape here. There we go. And then you're going to take your shortening, and you want to cover your fondant with a thin layer of this shortening. Just cover it all over, and that will help keep the moisture in your fondant. And then we're going to take some plastic wrap here. There we go. Nice big piece. And then we're going to wrap up our little piece of fondant, making sure it's completely sealed in there. And then just take one of our storage bags, put it in there, push all the air out as much as possible, and then seal it up. There we go. And that's how you're going to store your excess fondant. You don't have to refrigerate this. There's nothing in it that's going to mold or mildew or go bad or anything. You want to store it in a clean, dry, cool place. You don't want to have too much heat or too much temperature change. I've got a storage room in my basement that stays pretty much cool all year long, even through the summer and everything. So that's where I keep most of my fondant, to make sure that it's kind of the same temperature the whole time. If it gets too hot, this will heat up, and then if it gets cold again, it'll dry out just a lot faster on you. You also want to make sure it's a dark place. Again, with all the lights and everything, even in your house, it can fade your fondant. So you want to make sure that it's in a cool, dry, dark place. Okay, so we've got our fondant here, and this is already getting just a little bit dry. So I'm going to take some more shortening and kind of rub it onto my edges here to make sure that it softens it up, because when I'm smoothing it out, I don't want to run into my little elephant skin problem here. Okay, so with a round cake, you want to smooth this all the way around at the same level. You don't want to do one side and then the other and then the other, because at the very end you're going to have all these ripples just in one spot, and it will be really difficult to get it out. So we're going to start just a little ways down here. We're going to go about halfway down our cake, and as you've probably noticed already, just the weight of the fondant itself kind of gets this top part pretty smooth to the cake, so you don't have to worry about smoothing too much of it. It's just this bottom part here that gets all the nice ripples. Okay, so what you want to do once you get to this area that has your little ruffles in it is you want to pick it up, from the bottom like this. And you're going to hold it with one hand, and with the other hand you're going to push against the cake to smooth out the fondant there. You never want to pull or push down like that. You want to just lift and push against the cake. Okay, we are doing really good here. And of course, this fondant would stick better if it were a real cake. It would have that frosting, that icing underneath it to help it stick to my cake. If you are doing fake cakes, covering fake cakes, then what you want to do is take some plastic wrap again, and you're going to wrap up your cakes in the plastic wrap. And then you can take some of this piping gel here, and you can spread this onto the saran wrap all over your cake, and that will help to adhere the fondant to your cake. It's a nice sticky gel, and it will stick to it. It's also very forgivable, so if you need to reposition your fondant or anything, it stays sticky for a very good long time, and so you can easily pick it up and move it if you need to. Okay, so we're almost done here. Just keep going around, and any place where you have some little lines or anything, you can kind of squish them together, work on it that way, and they will come together very nicely. Okay, so this is about as far as I go with my hands. Now I'm going to switch to my fondant smoothers, and these are very handy dandy little guys. I really like using these. I like using two of them because I will hold the cake with one and smooth with the other. Okay, so at this point is where I do start to push down on my fondant with my fondant smoother. I don't do it too hard, and as you can see, I stopped here where I met a little ruffle. You don't want to try to work through that with your fondant smoother because it's just going to rip and tear everything. And in a moment, I'm going to show you what to do if you do get a rip or a tear in your fondant. Okay, so we're just going to smooth that all the way around here. I'm pushing down hard when I get to the bottom to create a little crease in my fondant to make sure that this fondant will hug my cake, and to show me where I need to cut off the fondant at the base here. Okay, we are almost there. And okay, good. This is really, really good. Okay. So now I'm going to take my large pizza cutter, and you can use anything. You can use a knife, you can use scissors. I really like the pizza cutter just because it rolls really smoothly and easily. I like the larger ones. I do have a smaller one here. This one works really well for small things, but this little handle part right here kind of gets in the way, sometimes gouges my fondant that I've worked so hard to get so nice and smooth. So I like these bigger ones for something like this. So I'm going to hold onto my cake with my fondant smoother and then just cut this all the way around. This is why I like working on my turntable, because it just turns very easily. I don't have to keep moving the cake. You can use a Lazy Susan. Anything works really well like that. Okay. Now I want to make sure to gently remove this, because if there is a spot where the pizza cutter has not cut through all the way, then it's going to pull my fondant off of my cake in a way that I don't want it to. Okay. So now we're going to take this and smooth it out just a little bit more. We've still got kind of a little ruffle here just because, again, this fondant is not sticking to my styrofoam dummy here, but that's okay. And then in some places, if you can see here, I did not get it all the way to the bottom, and that's completely fine. You can just use a really large border or a design or something to cover that up. And this is our, here we go, this is our basic covered cake for your fondant cake. So I'm going to show you next how to decorate a fondant cake just with some easy, fun decorations.